This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 513. Shout out Cincinnati of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The Belmont Stakes is coming up this weekend, and FanDuel Racing is helping you get in on the action. FanDuel will match your first deposit dollar for dollar, up to $50 when you open a new racing account. That's free money you can use to turn race day into payday. There's no promo code needed. Just download the FanDuel Racing app, make your first deposit, and you're off to the races. The app is super easy to use, and most payouts occur in a matter of minutes. Start building your bankroll today and be ready for race day on Saturday, June 5th. Check out racing.fanduel.com for more details. Today's a mailbag day. Let's get to it. The first question this week is from @FFTamir. Can you try to make sense of the Bengals wide receivers? I have no idea if I should be avoiding all three or targeting one based on their current ADP. I've said this before on the show, but I'm most worried about Tyler Boyd of the three wide receivers because he's likely to be most dependent on volume. I mean, all wide receivers are dependent on volume to be solid in fantasy football. But Boyd isn't used the same way as the other receivers. He's a slot guy. He played 84% of his snaps last year from the slot. His average depth of target last season was 8.8. T. Higgins and A.J. Green were at about 13 and 14. Higgins saw 3 more end zone targets than Tyler Boyd did as well. And Boyd's never seen more than 6 end zone targets in a single season. That's not a whole lot. There's nothing wrong with Tyler Boyd. I mean, I'm a Pitt alum. On a more personal level, I love Tyler Boyd, but he's naturally more volume dependent than players like Chase and Higgins will be because his depth of target is lower and the touchdown upside isn't as high. Now, with that being said, I don't think any of the three wide receivers are necessarily bad picks in redraft this year. All of them will project out to have decent volume because the Bengals don't use their tight ends a lot and because the Bengals have been incredibly pass heavy since Zach Taylor became head coach. And that's in neutral game scripts, not just overall ratio. They haven't been pass heavy because they've been bad. They've chosen to be pass heavy. I wouldn't be targeting those players on the same team, but I think drafting all three guys is fine this season. I like Higgins and Chase more than Boyd because of what I just talked about. But Boyd is in a spot in drafts where he's fine to take. It's not like his volume is just going to completely disappear. It's just that the upside is harder to find with Tyler Boyd versus the other wide receivers. This last question says, this offseason, I've accumulated a lot of Ronald Jones and KJ Hamler shares for cheap. Roast me, please. Who are 2 players you've identified as targets in Dynasty that oppose consensus? So I did a buy candidates episode way back at the beginning of the offseason where I had some lower key buys. Like I think Gerald Everett was one of them before he signed with Seattle. But I'll give you one player who I think that people are sleeping on a little bit this year and in Dynasty in general. And that's Mike Williams. He has a good quarterback. He's the number 2 option in that offense. The Chargers lost Hunter Henry, and they've got a new coaching staff. And speaking of that coaching staff, there was an article in The Athletic this week from Daniel Popper that talked about Mike Williams' role in that Chargers offense. It had some quotes from new offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi. Lombardi said, quote, as much as the offense will resemble New Orleans, he plays the X, and the ball has always kind of found the X receiver in this offense. I think that there will be some natural production that comes his way because of the nature of the offense. And then Lombardi also said, quote, I see a big role for him being Williams. If I were a betting man, I'd bet on nice numbers coming from him on the stat sheet, that's for sure. Now maybe some of this is coach speak, but it certainly doesn't hurt hearing that quote from the team's offensive coordinator. Mike Williams has a wide receiver 58 price tag right now according to Startup ADP over on dynastyleaguefootball.com. But he's actually a top 40 wide receiver for 2021 according to my projections right now. And he's still just 26 years old. I could see Williams having a career year from a yardage standpoint this season very easily. And if touchdown variance hits the right way, then he could give you more of a lower end wide receiver 2 campaign. This last question is from @WilliamHaven4. What are your thoughts on Bryan Edwards going into this season? He has a clear path to targets if he stays healthy, and I really like his profile. Thanks. Love the show. Thanks. Yeah, so Edwards was another one of my buy candidates this offseason as well. Lots of data backs the idea that if a player doesn't do a whole lot as a rookie, the chance that he pans out, it's pretty slim. The reason I'm still cool with being in on Edwards, though, is that the cost to acquire is not very significant. This isn't a N'Keal Harry situation, where after Harry's rookie season, he still had almost a wide receiver 3 price tag in startups. You could still sell N'Keal Harry for a decent return. Like you said, Edwards has a good profile. He had an elite breakout age coming out of college, and my model had him as an 85th percentile wide receiver. My model did like Henry Ruggs a little bit more, but that was strictly based on draft capital. So sure, throw a dart at Bryan Edwards. I drafted Edwards in that MFL 10 of death that I'm in with a bunch of fantasy analysts that I referenced on last week's show. The Raiders have a depth chart that Bryan Edwards can overcome. He's talented, and at least you can blame some of his poor production last year on injury. If his price was higher, I would not be buying. The chance that he works out is not very high, but at least he has a baseline profile to work off of. This last question is from @EvanFantasy. I'm gravitating towards Phillip Lindsay as a player who fits your breakout running back mold. Is that a proper conclusion to come to? So if you guys remember from last year, almost exactly 1 year ago, I looked at traits that breakout running backs seem to share in fantasy football. I did a whole study on it. You can scroll back and listen to episode 381 that talks through it. The 4 things that I found were that breakout running backs were rarely handcuffs. They also came from ambiguous backfields. They were typically pass catchers, or they had a disproportionate amount of targets versus rushes, and they were of all ages. Phillip Lindsay definitely hits on the ambiguous backfield piece, and he's not a handcuff. My hesitation with dubbing him a go-to breakout guy is that he's not the best pass catcher in the world, and he's not even the best pass catcher in his own backfield. I'm not fully against drafting Phillip Lindsay, especially at cost. But considering how bad that offense could be this season, I don't think he's the most likely breakout running back candidate. This next question is from @DadOfWarUK. Is there a situation where you see a trade increasing Julio Jones' value in fantasy? And would the Falcons wide receiver 2 be worth targeting, or is this going to be the Pitts and Calvin Ridley show? So I predictably and understandably got a lot of Julio Jones questions this week. I thought this one was the most interesting because we're essentially talking about whether we should be raising or lowering Julio Jones' range of outcomes. And I think we should be lowering them. There are some spots where I think that he would be fine enough. Like if he went to Tennessee, he could capture a 25 to 30% target share, maybe hit like 140 targets. And again, that's across 17 games. But those would likely be efficient targets. And Julio is an alpha who's going to command a high target share no matter where he goes. But I think Atlanta is pretty much the best realistic spot for him. It's at least one of the best spots for him. The Falcons defense is going to force the offense to be pretty pass heavy. And why wouldn't they want to be pass heavy with the weapons that they currently have on that team? I love Julio. I think he's still got a little bit left in the tank. But I'm not sure his price should increase in a new location. As for the Falcons wide receiver 2, I'd be betting on Russell Gage. Gage had probably the quietest 72 catch season in NFL history last year. Seriously, he caught 72 balls. When Julio missed time last year, we didn't necessarily see Gage go off. But when Atlanta started using Russell Gage more down the stretch without Julio Jones in the lineup, so the final 4 weeks of the season, things changed a bit. If we assume no Julio, that means Gage could hypothetically be playing more snaps. Well, Gage played 70% or more of Atlanta's snaps in 8 games last year. In those games, he averaged a 22.5% target share per game and almost 15 PPR points per game. Outside of those contests, that target share dropped 9 percentage points to 13.5%. And the points per game dropped to 7.8. So if Russell Gage is on the field more, I like his chances to be fantasy relevant in some way. He won't be able to hit that target share that he hit last year more than likely in that split because Kyle Pitts is around. But I don't think a 20% share is out of the question if Julio Jones is indeed gone. This next question is from @JewelMiracle. Everybody is always robust RB or zero RB or anchor RB or modified zero RB. Is it not optimal to have a balanced team? What's optimal is having the best team. Balance doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. You can be balanced with a bunch of average players. That's not going to win you a fantasy championship. Strategies like the ones that you listed, they exist for a bunch of reasons. But the main reason they exist is to increase your probability of winning. When you can approach your draft with general guidelines, and when those general guidelines have proven to be successful in the past, you're able to enhance the chances of putting together an optimal roster. That roster does not have to be balanced. It just has to be optimal. I think the episode from earlier this week with Mike Leone really shed light to this. It's not always about the individual players that you're drafting. Roster construction and how you approach your draft in order to get the right players, that matters just as much, if not more in a lot of cases. One of my least favorite phrases in the fantasy football space is when analysts say that strategy doesn't matter if you just draft the right players. Yeah, no crap. Do you know what helps you pick the right players at the right time? What helps you formulate a roster construction that's best to handle the weekly fantasy football injury storm throughout the fall? Strategy. Strategy is what helps you do that. Now, Joel, I'm not saying that you don't believe in strategy. I know I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. But I do think it's important to think about optimizing your roster before balancing your roster, because those are two very, very different things. This next question is from @Micah_Bedsole. What's the strategy for handcuffs this year with having an 18-week schedule? Is it smart to draft handcuffs higher this year? So I'm going to take this answer in a pretty different direction than you might think, Micah. A handful of years ago, I did a study on handcuffing in fantasy football, or the art of taking a worthless backup running back who would only become relevant with an injury to a starting teammate. There are lots and lots of ways to define what a handcuff is, which is why this study was kind of hard to do. But what I found with that study is that handcuffs are tough to predict, meaning we don't always know who the handcuff is going to be for a particular running back. I also found that when a handcuff got an opportunity, they generally didn't perform very well. We just remember the ones that did perform well. And then running back injuries also don't occur right away. The average injury that allowed a handcuff to step in happened in like week 9, according to the study. So you're holding onto that asset all season long for something that may not even happen, or that may not happen for a little while. You're sort of wasting a roster spot. And that handcuff is usually the first player that you drop anyway. Now, there are some running back handcuffs that are worthwhile, or who we have a pretty good idea would step in and handle a big workload. There just aren't that many of them. Realistically, when we talk handcuffs, we're talking about like 2 players. What I've found to be more worthwhile is what I talked about earlier with the Phillip Lindsay question. Breakout running backs come from ambiguous backfields and aren't typically handcuffs. I know that's not always the case. I'm just talking about what generally happens. So instead of drafting handcuffs in your traditional redraft league, and I'm not talking about best ball here. I talked about that with Mike Leone earlier in the week on the show. But instead of getting handcuffs, throw some darts at backfields that are more up in the air. Your chance of hitting on those players is higher than hitting on a random handcuff. But again, so much of this comes down to how you're really defining handcuff. The last question this week is from @YZR_fantasy. Why would anyone take A.J. Brown as a top 3 wide receiver in redraft? To be honest, I think it's pretty easy to see a path to where A.J. Brown is a top 3 wide receiver in redraft. And even if he doesn't hit that high of a mark, I can understand why someone would want to draft him as a top 3 wide receiver. My projections have Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, Stephon Diggs, and Tyreek Hill ahead of A.J. Brown. But the gap isn't anything Brown can't overcome. He's actually almost identical to Tyreek Hill on a points per game basis. A lot of people will say it's obvious that Brown has a high ceiling because of vacated targets. Jonnu Smith is gone. Corey Davis is gone. Who else is Ryan Tannehill going to throw to? Now, I don't believe vacated targets are really a thing because team pass rates change every season. So it's not a one-to-one relationship with the amount of volume going around in an offense. Not only that, but vacated targets don't just go to one player. With that being said, thinking in terms of vacated target share, that's not a terrible way to approach things, because that's not dependent on pass rates and team philosophy. Now, to be clear, targets are earned. A player leaving a team doesn't automatically mean another player will gobble up that player's volume. If that existing player sucks, then he won't see volume. He needs to get open to earn a target. But we know A.J. Brown is extremely good. He's one of the best wide receivers in football. He had about a 20% target share during his rookie season, and in 14 games last year, his target share was close to 23%. If you look at that on a per game basis, because he did miss time, his target share per game was 27.3%. Projecting A.J. Brown for a 28% target share given this current team could honestly be considered conservative. He was basically at that share on a per-game basis last year, and now there's no Corey Davis and Jonnu Smith. And like I said, Brown is good. He can earn those extra targets. With that type of target share, you can easily get to 140 plus targets for A.J. Brown. And remember, this is across 17 games. Given how efficient Brown is thanks to his ability after the catch and what he's been able to do already for multiple seasons on a per target basis, 140 targets can go a very long way for A.J. Brown. And then there's even room for growth there. I say this all the time on the show, but if you look at the players who have historically seen insanely high target shares, most of those seasons came as a result of not having a lot of competition. You can think of it this way. Elite players will see good target shares because they're good at the game. Those same elite players can then see obscenely high target shares when there are not alternatives in their offense. I could go down a list of all wide receivers since 2011 that hit a 30% target share in a single season, and the majority of them did so without sincere competition on their team. Brandon Marshall in 2012, he had a 40% target share. His top wide receiver competition was Earl Bennett. Alshon Jeffrey was a rookie, and Alshon Jeffrey only played 10 games. Michael Thomas in 2019, Ted Ginn was his top wide receiver competition. DeAndre Hopkins in 2017, Bruce Ellington was number 2 on the Texans that year in targets. That's generally how things go. But all the while, those players, those elite players, are still locked into high target shares because they're elite. So with A.J. Brown, he's still locked into a target share of 25, 26% as long as he's healthy. He's shown us no reason to believe otherwise. But that number can rise significantly because of the competition on that team and the fact that he's good. And if the Titans end up seeing more negative game scripts than some expect, then we could see better than projected volume in Tennessee. And that's where a crazy, crazy wide receiver 1 type ceiling could really hit for A.J. Brown. Considering he's close to Tyreek Hill in my projections, and considering Devontae Adams may not have Aaron Rodgers, I can see why someone would take A.J. Brown as a top 3 wide receiver this year in redraft. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a great weekend.